There are two main ways to bind off of knitting. One is to use knitting needles, and the other is to use a yarn needle. We can replace all methods of knitting needles with methods of crocheting hook. I'll start with 4 basic bind offs and then introduce their applied bind offs. Let's crochet the most basic bind off, standard bind off. First, crochet a chain stitch with yarn under. When we do crocheting, we usually do it in a yarn over manner, but we need to do it in a yarn under manner to have the same structure as the knitting. In other words, you put the thread under the crochet hook and pull it out. After crocheting the chain stitch, crochet slip stitches. When crocheting these slip stitches, also use the yarn under method. You now have standard bind off. When you make a standard bind off with knitting needles, you make a knit stitch, then cover it with the right side stitch, and so on. The one made with a crochet hook and the one made with knitting needles has the same structure. As a side note, if you crochet in a general way instead of the yarn under method, you will get a bind off with a mirrored structure. To crochet the purl type standard bind off, you need crochet purl stitches with a crochet hook. First, crochet a purl chain stitch. Hang the thread from the front toward the other side and pull it out. After pulling it out, turn the crochet hook to the other side and return it to its original position. From now on, crochet purl slip stitches. Insert a crochet hook like when knitting a purl stitch with needles. Hook the thread from the front to the other side and pull out from 2 loops together. After pulling it out, turn the crochet hook to the other side and return it to its original position. If you pull it out like this, you will have a purl type standard bind off. In the case of knitting with needles, you need to take the steps of knitting the purl stitch and passing the right stitch over the left stitch. Or you can put the purl stitch back to the left needle and knit 2 stitches together. The structure is the same for both. If you crochet K2tog Bind Off, insert the hook into the 2 stitches of the left needle from the left side and crochet a chain stitch in a general way. Then, return this stitch to the left needle. As a point of attention, insert the needle from the right side of the stitch. After putting back the stitch, put the crochet hook into the 2 stitches from the left side and crochet a chain. Repeat this step. The structure of standard bind off is to crochet slip stitches on the stitches of the last row. On the other hand, the structure of K2tog Bind Off is to crochet chain stitches through the stitches of the last row. When knitting with needles, repeat K2tog. It is a repetition that you return the knitted stitch to the left needle and knit 2 stitches together. In the case of K2tog Bind Off, you must reinsert the needle once, whether you use knitting needles or a crochet hook. So the labor required is not so different. Without knitting bind off, we don't crochet yarn. Repeat the operation of pulling out the next stitch from the right stitch. When knitting with needles, insert the right needle into the 2 stitches as if knitting the knit stitch, and pass the right stitch over the left stitch. These 4 are the basic bind-offs. By adding some operations to these primitives, you can create applied bind-offs. The first applied operation I will introduce is twisting the stitches. When you crochet standard bind-off, you usually insert a hook as if making a knit stitch. However, if you insert a hook as if you make a purl stitch and crochet a slip stitch, you can make a twisted stitch. It is called decrease bind off. Many explanations of how to knit using needles are as follows. Insert the needle as if you were knitting a purl stitch and perform K2tog. However, the structure is the same if you knit the twisted stitch and cover it with the right stitch. So, decrease bind off is a twisted stitch version of standard bind off. The next one is called elastic bind off. The crochet method is very plain. If you do all the operations to pull out the thread in the way of yarn under and make single crochet stitches, it will be elastic bind off. Compared to single crochet stitches crocheted commonly, you can see that the leg parts are twisting. In the case of knitting with needles, return the 2 stitches to the left needle after making the knit stitch. Then, insert the right needle as if knitting the purl stitch, and knit the 2 stitches together. In the case of decrease bind off, we make the stitches on the last row twisted. On the other hand, in the case of elastic bind off, we make new stitches and make the stitches twisted. Next, I will introduce an applied operation of adding chain stitches. If you add a chain stitch between the slip stitches of standard bind off, it becomes Picot chain bind off. You crochet both slip stitches and chain stitches with the yarn under method. In the case of knitting with needles, after doing the standard bind off, put the thread from the front to the other side and pass the right stitch over the loop. Hanging the thread on the needle and placing the knit stitch over it corresponds to crocheting a chain stitch with a hook. A bind off that is very similar to Picot chain bind off is standard bind off's twice worked variation. In this bind off, we will crochet the chain stitch using the yarn under method, but we will crochet the slip stitch in the general way. When knitting with needles, after doing the standard bind off, return to the left needle and make a knit stitch. The operation to return and make a knit stitch corresponds to the operation to crochet a chain stitch. There is almost no difference between Picot chain bind off and standard bind off's twice worked variation except for the direction of pulling out the thread. To add chain stitches to without knitting bind off results in Icelandic bind off. In the case of crocheting with a hook, after pulling out the next stitch from the right stitch, the procedure is to crochet a chain stitch with the yarn under method. In the case of knitting with needles, after doing without knitting bind off, hang the thread on the needle from the front to the other side and then cover the loop with the right stitch. Or, you can pull out the left stitch from the right stitch and make a knit stitch there. It is just a collection of operations. There is no difference in the finished structure. Next, I will introduce the applied operation of adding picots. Let's make picots in the middle of standard bind off. Crochet chain stitches with yarn under method, and then crochet slip stitches on them. Now you have a picot. You can freely adjust the height of the picots and the spacing between them. In the case of knitting with needles, make new stitches in the middle of standard bind off by the knit cast on method. do a standard bind off on the stitches to make a picot. Because knit cast on is structurally the same as chain stitches, you can make picots in this way. Next, I will introduce the applied operation of increase slip stitches. The basic is the same as standard bind off, but if you crochet 2 slip stitches in the same stitch, it becomes frilled standard bind off. In the case of knitting with needles, when making the knit stitch, leave the stitch without removing it from the left stitch. After passing the right stitch over it, you make a knit stitch again on the remaining stitch and pass the right stitch over it. In other words, you make 2 knit stitches in one stitch to make a standard bind off. Next, I will introduce the yarn over applied operation. The basic is the same as standard bind off, but you hang the thread from the front toward the other side before crocheting a slip stitch. When pulling out the thread, pull it out from all the loops on the hook. You now have yarn over bind off. When you knit with needles, you put the thread from the front to the other side and then make a knit stitch. There will be 3 loops on the right needle. First, pass the center loop over the left loop. And pass the right stitch over the left stitch. You can pass 2 stitches over the left stitch at the same time. Next, I will introduce the applied operation of how to insert a hook. The basic is the same as standard bind off. However, if you insert the hook into the top loop on the right side and crochet a slip stitch, you will get a 1/2 bind off. When knitting with needles, you put 3 stitches on the right needle and pass the rightmost stitch over the remaining 2 stitches. The applied variations discussed so far have used only knit stitches, but I will now introduce 3 bind offs using purl stitches. It is mainly for ribbing. To combine the knit and purl versions of standard bind off results in ribbing bind off. Crochet slip stitches on knit stitches with yarn under method, and crochet purl slip stitches on purl stitches. When knitting with needles, make knit stitches on knit stitches, make purl stitches on purl stitches, and pass the right stitch over the left stitch. Incidentally, if you do K2tog, you can quickly create purl versions of standard bind off. However, there is no change in the structure itself. Combine K2tog Bind Off and Purl version of standard bind off results in cable bind off. Alternate between chain stitches that go through the stitches and purl slip stitches. However, in cable bind off, you crochet the chain stitch with the yarn under method. Because, unlike K2tog Bind Off, you crochet the next slip stitch without reinserting the hook. When knitting with needles, perform K2tog Bind Off and Purl version standard bind off alternately. In the case of K2tog Bind Off, return the stitch to the left needle and perform K2tog. In the case of the Purl version of standard bind off, return the stitch to the left needle and perform K2tog. Combine ribbing bind off and yarn over bind off results in Jeny's surprisingly stretchy bind off. The basic is the same as ribbing bind off, but you should put the thread on the hook before crocheting slip stitches. Note that the direction of yarn placement on the hook differs between the knit stitch and the purl stitch. When making knit stitches, you put the thread from the other side to the front, and finally, the thread goes out to the other side of the fabric. When making purl stitches, you put the thread from the front toward the other side, and finally, the thread comes out to the front side of the fabric. When knitting with needles, you hang the thread first and make the next stitch. The direction of the thread is the same as crocheting. There will now be 3 loops on the right side needle, so put the center loop over the left loop. And put the right loop over the left loop. Repeating these steps results in Jeny's surprisingly stretchy bind off. So far, we've looked at the 4 basic bind-offs and their derivative bind-offs. For your information, it is possible to create bind-offs other than those described here, depending on the combination of applied operations. Binding off with a crochet hook has the added benefit of simplifying the movement and clarifying the structure. If you have a crochet hook, please try it. Thank you for watching.